this video, we will take a look at the body systems. One of the first concepts we think about when we talk about physiology is this concept of homeostasis. So what is homeostasis? Homeostasis describes the fact that your internal body conditions stay within a relatively narrow range. Doesn't mean that they're constant. Your body temperature does change. It just doesn't change wildly. Same thing with your blood sugar. Why is that important? Your body requires a certain set point for the cells to work correctly. So we might have a certain body temperature that everything works really well, and if it gets too high or too low, it doesn't work. So we have to keep it within that range. And one of the ways that we do this is using negative feedback. In negative feedback, if there is a change inside of the body in this internal condition, we adjust it back the other way. So if your temperature goes up, we adjust it back down. If we are talking about the regulation of temperature, we call it thermoregulation. Let's look at how this might work. If your body temperature falls, the blood vessels that go to your skin constrict. It keeps the flow of blood more towards the core of your body and takes it away from that outer surface. And that's where you lose a lot of your heat to the environment. By keeping it closer to your core, you're not losing as much heat. The other thing that can happen is we can have shivering. When your muscles shiver, they produce heat, and that will warm the body. If you get too warm, now your blood vessels going to the skin are going to dilate, sending a lot more to the surface. That's why you appear red when this happens. That's going to cause you to lose a lot more heat to your environment, get rid of that heat. We're also going to trigger the sweat glands, and that will increase evaporative cooling and help you to cool your body. When we talk about thermoregulation, we have two basic ways of doing it. We can have endotherms, which regulate their body internally, which is what we just described. Birds and mammals are endotherms. Other organisms, like some reptiles, can still maintain a fairly consistent body temperature, but they are ectotherms. So rather than doing it internally, they do it externally. So they might bask in the sun, they might go into the shade or down into a burrow to help regulate that body temperature. Next, we have the concept of osmoregulation. Osmoregulation is essentially allowing organisms to regulate their balance of water and electrolytes. So electrolytes are ions that are typically dissolved in water. The water and electrolyte balance is very important for the proper maintenance of healthy cells and tissues. Organisms that live in different environments have different challenges when it comes to osmoregulation. An organism living in salt water has the problem of losing water to their environment and becoming almost too concentrated. They have to have certain mechanisms in place to avoid that. An organism living in fresh water is constantly taking in water and losing ions, so they have to have different kinds of mechanisms for dealing with that. And then, of course, terrestrial organisms are primarily constantly losing water to their environment. The excretory system helps with osmoregulation. The organs that make up the excretory system are the kidneys. We see the kidneys here. This is a magnified view of that kidney. We've cut into that and opened it up so we can see inside. We have an artery coming in carrying blood. This kidney is going to filter that blood, and it's going to help regulate the water and the ion balance of the bloodstream. After that blood is filtered, what remains that has been taken off will come down here through the ureters, which we can see over here, connecting the kidneys down to the bladder. The bladder is mostly for storage. It goes from the bladder out of the body through the urethra. Sitting here on top of the kidneys, these adrenal glands help the body to regulate that balance. Next, we have the digestive system. First, on the digestive system, we have the oral cavity. One of the ways that we start to break down food first is by chewing, which is mastication. We also have salivary glands. Salivary glands produce an enzyme called amylase, which helps to break down starch. When we're finished chewing the food and we swallow it, it becomes a bolus. That bolus is going to be moved down through the GI tract through waves of muscular contraction called peristalsis. It's going to go into the esophagus, to the stomach. The stomach will secrete pepsin. Pepsin is primarily there for digesting proteins. This liquidy substance we now have as a result of the digestion that goes on in the stomach, we call chyme. That will then enter the small intestine, starting here. The small intestine is primarily the area where we're going to have most of our nutrient absorption, some more digestion and a lot of nutrient absorption going on. And because of that, if you open up the small intestine and look, what you'll find is the walls are all folded over into these structures called villi, and then the villi are folded over even more into microvilli. And that's to increase the surface area. So you have a lot of surface inside that little area so that you can absorb all of those nutrients. The liver produces bile, which then also goes into the small intestine. The small intestine is also broken up into 3 subsections called the duodenum. The duodenum is right here as it leaves the stomach. The jejunum, which is the middle part, and then towards the end, right before it goes into the large intestine, we have the ileum. Then we have the large intestine, which is also called the colon. The primary job of the large intestine is to resorb water. So we want to bring back as much water as we can in the body. Remember, we're terrestrial organisms. We've got to conserve water. And your colon is split into 4 major areas. This is where the small intestine is going to empty into the colon. It's going to go up, so that's the ascending colon. It's going to come across, that's the transverse colon. It's going to come down, that's the descending colon. And then right here, it forms a little bit like an S shape. That's the sigmoid colon. From there, it's going to go into the rectum, whose primary job is just to store feces, and then out through the anus. We do have some accessory organs that work with the digestive system. The liver produces bile. The bile is stored in the gallbladder. Bile is to help us break down fats. The pancreas is sitting in here between the stomach and the small intestine. The pancreas has several jobs, but here its digestive role is to secrete some enzymes to help break down food. When we look at nutrition, we can think about the major categories of food. We have our carbohydrates, which are primarily there for energy. We have proteins for creating muscle and enzymes and some other structures. We have fats. One of the big roles of fats is to cover some of our nerve cells. We also have fiber. Fiber is essentially the undigestible portion of the carbohydrates. So when we eat plants, we do not have the enzymes to break down cellulose. Cellulose, remember, is the cell walls that we see in plants. So what we call fiber in our diet is actually that cellulose. So if you're on something like a low carbohydrate diet, what they have you do is to calculate net carbohydrates. So what are the total carbohydrates in this food that you're eating? And now go ahead and subtract out the fiber because your body's just going to eliminate that. Then you're left with your net carbohydrates. So you can still eat carbohydrates if you increase the fiber content. An essential nutrient is something you must consume. Your body cannot make it. Some things we can actually make inside of our body using other raw materials. Essential nutrients we can't. Some of our amino acids are essential. Not all of them, but some of them are essential. We have to have them in our diet. Some fatty acids are essential. You've heard of EFAs. Those are essential fatty acids. Vitamins are essential, and so are many of the minerals that are required in our body. Next, we have the respiratory system. What is the overall function of the respiratory system? Primarily to bring in oxygen so that we can deliver it to our tissues, and then also to pick up the carbon dioxide, which is a waste product that those tissues are producing, and get those out of the body. The diaphragm is a large sheet-like muscle that sits here under your lungs. It regulates inhalation and exhalation. When this diaphragm drops down, it allows the lungs to expand with air, and then when it pops back up, it allows the air to leave the lungs. Let's look at how air passes through this system. We're going to take an inhalation. The air is going to come through the nasal cavity up here. Then it's going to go through the pharynx. Then it's going to pass through the larynx, which is also your voice box. Then down the trachea. Trachea are going to split into 2, one into each lung. Those are the primary bronchi. Once it gets into the lung, it's going to split again into secondary bronchi, and then those are going to split even more into bronchioles. And then at the very end of those bronchioles, we're going to have these little sac-like structures called alveoli. That's where the actual gas exchange is going to occur. It's going to be a wet membrane there, surrounded by lots of capillaries. The oxygen is going to go from the air sac of the lung into the blood vessel, and the CO2 is going to leave and go back into the alveoli. And then, of course, when we exhale, we're just going to go the opposite direction. Let's look at the circulatory system. The overall function is to take the blood and to move it throughout the body. And of course, the main reason we want to do that is we have that oxygen we need to deliver to tissues. We have the CO2 we need to remove. So we have the nutrients we got from our GI tract that we need to deliver to these other cells. We have other waste products that those cells are producing that we need to get rid of. Our circulatory system is closed. Remember when we looked at animal diversity, some animals have an open circulatory system, so it doesn't stay under pressure. It goes into sort of a large chamber, and it loses all of its pressure when it does that. Ours stays under pressure. We have a heart with 4 chambers, 2 atria, and 2 ventricles. The top 2 chambers are atria, the bottom 2 chambers are the ventricles. This person is facing us, so this is the right atria and ventricle on this side, left atria and ventricle on that side. The valves in the heart keep the blood from going backwards. When we push the blood out of one chamber, we don't want it to come back in. And so these valves keep that from flowing backwards. If you have an issue with a valve, your heart is having to work extra hard and the blood flow is not as efficient. The right side of the heart over here is going to receive blood from the body, and then it's going to pump it out to the lungs. That's called the pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary referring to the lungs. The left side is going to receive it from the lungs, and then it's going to send it out to the body. That's the systemic. Systemic is of the body. Let's take a look at how blood flows through this system. We're going to come from the superior and the inferior vena cava. We see here in blue up at the top and the bottom. Your superior vena cava is going to essentially collect all the blood that's coming from above the heart and bring it back to the heart. And the inferior vena cava is going to collect all the blood coming from below your heart and bring it back to the heart. That's going to go into the right atrium. So it's going to come into here. It's going to go through a tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Then it's going to be sent to the lungs, exchange gases, come back to the left atrium right here. Then it's going to go through another valve called the bicuspid valve down into the left ventricle. And then the left ventricle is going to send it out the aorta, which is the major vessel coming off the top of the heart. And then that's going to go through the rest of the body. And from the body, it's going to come back to the superior and inferior vena cava. The cardiac cycle looks at the series of contractions that occurs to allow it to pump blood through the heart and then eventually through the body. There's going to be a series of contractions and relaxations. We have the atria on top, the right atria and the left, and then we have the ventricles below, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. The aorta sends blood from the left ventricle out to the rest of the body. Here are those 2 vena cavas entering into the right atrium. In this first picture, we're looking at cardiac diastole. All of the chambers are relaxed and blood is flowing in. In the middle, we have atrial systole. The atria are going to contract, so these top chambers are going to contract. The bottom chambers here, the ventricles, are going to remain relaxed. That is going to push blood from the atria into the ventricle. Then we're going to get contraction of the ventricles while the atria are relaxing. So when the ventricles contract, when it comes off of the right ventricle, it's going to go into the vessels leading to the lungs. And when this left ventricle contracts, it's going to come out here and go to the body. That's pushing blood out of the heart, either to the pulmonary system or to the systemic system. Now, another thing that goes along with this cardiac cycle is the idea of the electrical impulses that are causing those contractions to occur. Right up here at the top of this right atrium, we have a little area called the sinoatrial node or the SA node, which is sometimes referred to as the pacemaker of the heart. These cells establish the rhythm. They start beating rhythmically, and then all the other cells across the surface will beat in tune to the rhythm that they set. So when you have an ECG done, what they're doing is testing that electrical system of the heart. Now let's take a quick look at the blood vessels. We have arteries. In this diagram, they are indicated in red. They take blood from the heart to the rest of the body. They are going to carry oxygenated blood, and that's going to go, of course, to all the organs and muscles. These arteries are going to get smaller and smaller until they end up very tiny vessels called capillaries, and that's where the actual gas exchange is going to occur between your tissues and blood vessels. Leaving the tissue, so leaving a muscle after we've had this gas exchange, these capillaries are going to join together to form larger and larger vessels. These are the veins. The veins are indicated in blue, and they are returning the blood back to the heart. The blood now is deoxygenated because we've extracted the oxygen from it in the tissues. Sometimes you'll hear people make this statement that the blood inside your body is blue until it touches air. That is not at all true. We go from heart to arteries, capillaries to veins, back to the heart. Now let's switch to the endocrine system. The endocrine system produces hormones. Hormones are a variety of different types of chemicals. They communicate to lots of different tissues throughout the body. We can control things locally, but this is more of a global control. We're going to make chemicals in one part of the body, and we're going to send them through the bloodstream to other parts of the body to regulate other cells. These other cells will have receptors on them, And those receptors will be very specific to particular types of hormones. So some cells will respond to certain hormones and other cells will not respond. It depends whether they have the receptors or not. You may hear of the term upregulation and downregulation. This is a change in the receptors of these tissues that allow them to either become more sensitive to the chemicals, which is upregulation, then downregulation, they have fewer receptors and they're less sensitive. Some medications can alter the number of receptors, and so they can act as upregulators and downregulators. Let's take a look at some of the endocrine glands. We have the pituitary gland that sits here in the brain. It is considered the master regulator of the endocrine system. It secretes a lot of hormones that then tell other endocrine organs what to do. The thyroid gland sitting here near the trachea, it primarily regulates your overall metabolism. If you have a low thyroid, you might be very tired and have low energy. It also regulates the calcium level in your blood, and it does that in association with these parathyroid glands. So those two together help regulate your blood calcium levels. We also have the adrenal glands. They regulate ion balance, sugar balance, and a variety of stress responses. The pancreas, we said before, sits in between the stomach and the small intestine. So far, when we looked at the pancreas, we talked about its digestive function, but it also has an endocrine function. It produces insulin and glucagon, which regulate your blood glucose level. And then, of course, the gonads, which are not pictured here, also are endocrine organs. This shows some of the different hormones and the effects of those hormones. Let's look at the skeletal system. We can separate the skeletal system into the axial skeleton, so the axis of the body here in blue. It includes the bones of the skull. You have little bones inside the ear, a hyoid bone sitting under here, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage, which has the ribs and the sternum. Then the appendicular skeleton refers to appendages, and then how those appendages attach to the axial skeleton. The pectoral girdle up here, the scapula and clavicle, it attaches the arm to the axial skeleton. Then we have the pelvic girdle here, which attaches the legs to the axial skeleton. When two bones join together, we call that a joint. Joints might be movable or not movable. We have three basic types of joints. We have fibrous joints we see in this first picture. The sutures of the skull are fibrous joints. We also have cartilaginous joints. One example we see here is between your vertebrae, the intervertebral discs. And then we also have the synovial joints. Synovial joints have a space in here that's filled with fluid. These give us a wider range of motion, so your shoulder, knee, hip are synovial joints. Now let's take a look at the muscular system. The muscular system is there for movement, and it depends what kind of muscle we're looking at. Here we're looking at skeletal muscle. So we have muscles attached to bones, and together we get movement. The way that muscles work is we see one crossing a joint. So we have our bicep muscle here. It's attached up here at the top, and then it goes across this joint and attaches here. The muscle will shorten, and it's going to pull this part of the arm up towards the other. And muscles are typically in antagonistic pairs. If I want to then stretch that arm back out, I can't do it by pushing on this because muscles cannot push, they have to pull. So what I have to do is to look at this muscle on the back side, which is the tricep, and when it shortens, it's going to pull this back the other way. If I look at this under a microscope, I see three basic types of muscle tissue. I have skeletal muscle tissue, which is the type of muscle we just looked at. It attaches to the skeleton and causes movement of the bones. This is smooth muscle. This is muscle that is found primarily along the GI tract. It does that peristaltic wave of contraction that we saw in the GI system. And then in the heart, we have cardiac muscle. Let's take a quick look at the nervous system. The nervous system is composed of two major parts, the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is essentially everything else. All the nerves and different ganglia are part of the peripheral nervous system. Now let's look at the cells of the nervous system. One of the major types of cells in the nervous system is called the neuron. This is the type of cell that's actually sending the signals. So your nervous system is communicating from one part of your body to another. It's sending pain signals, or it's sending signals out from your brain telling your arm to move. And the type of cells sending these signals are the neurons. And the signal's going to run one direction. This signal is going to run down this individual cell, starting from up here down this way. Let's imagine that this is a cell that's trying to talk to this other cell. The signal's coming from this cell, and it's going to be received by the neuron on the dendrites. That signal is going to be turned into like an electrical signal that's going to move almost like a wave across this cell body right here. You may have many coming in from different directions. Right here in the cell body is where this cell is going to decide, should I send the signal forward or not? If it does, it's kind of like firing a gun. It's all or none. So it's either going to send the signal or it's not going to send the signal. It doesn't send a weak signal or a strong signal. So it's on or off. That signal is going to go all the way down this long extension called the axon. This axon in some types of neurons is covered with a fatty tissue called the myelin sheath. So when we talked about our essential fatty acids before, one reason why we have to have fats in our diet is for these myelin sheaths. The signal is going to come all the way down to the very end here, and this is where it's going to communicate with another cell. So maybe there's a muscle cell or an organ sitting here, and it's going to communicate with that at this synapse. This synapse is likely to secrete a substance called a neurotransmitter. So that neurotransmitter will then have an effect on this next cell. Now there's other cells in the nervous system other than these neurons called glial cells. Glial cells might be supporting kinds of cells, helping neurons to develop and to grow. When we have new neuron growth, they can guide that direction. We see some cells here that are helping form that myelin sheath. It may regulate the chemical environment around this neuron so that it can function correctly. Another important component in our central nervous system are the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid. This is looking at a section of the brain and then the skull. You have layers of protective membrane around your brain. Right up against the brain right here, we have pia mater. It's going in all those little crevices. Then we have a little space here called the subarachnoid space. Then we have the arachnoid mater. And then we have another space called the subdural space. And then we have the dura mater. So we have three layers, dura, arachnoid, and pia. And then we have some space in between them. And those spaces are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So we're sort of bathing the brain and the spinal cord in this fluid. This green that we see here is actually deep inside that brain. We've just made it so that we can try to see it. We have these ventricles here. These are areas throughout the brain where this cerebrospinal fluid flows. It also comes down here and flows down through the middle of the spinal cord, and it also flows around the outside of the spinal cord. If we look at the meninges of the spinal cord, same sort of thing. Right up against the spinal cord, we have the pia mater. We have that subarachnoid space, the arachnoid mater, a subdural space, and then the dura mater. What the spinal cord has that the brain doesn't is another space here between the bone and the dura mater called the epidural space. When a person is given an epidural, say during childbirth, the medication is put into that epidural space. If you have a condition where they might suspect that you have like encephalitis or meningitis, they will take a sample of this cerebrospinal fluid in here. Now let's take a quick look at the brain. This image is showing us the outer surface of the brain. Imagine your brain looks a little bit like a mushroom. You have this stem here. This is the brain stem going down into the spinal cord. A lot of functions like regulating breathing and that sort of thing are happening here in this brain stem. Back here on the back, we have the cerebellum. This is regulating a lot of our coordinated movements. So we're looking at it from the side. If I look down, we can see we have two cerebral hemispheres. So we're only seeing half of it right here. And we have a very deep fissure in between those two. If I cut the brain this way and then open it up, this is what it would look like. On the outer surface where we see the bumps here, this is what we see. That's called gray matter. Gray matter is mostly those cell bodies of the neurons we just saw. So there's a lot of processing there. Remember, cell bodies are essentially decision points in our nervous system. In here is white matter. White matter is mostly myelinated axons. So that's mostly highway system. So a lot of processing out here on the edge and a lot of highway system in between. Here we have a big highway system that connects the left and the right sides of your cerebral hemispheres, because it's important for one side of the brain to know what the other side is up to. If I was to take this image over here on the left and flip it and look at it from the inside, we can see that there's other areas in there. Here's our brain stem, but we also have this area here called the thalamus. It's kind of a relay station. Messages are going to come up and down the spinal cord here in through the brainstem. It's going to be directed which way to go in this thalamus. Is this a message that needs to go over here to the occipital lobe? Where do I need to send that message? And then we also have the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is also closely connected to the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is part nervous system, and then it also has an endocrine function. So sometimes we talk about the neuroendocrine system of the body because there is a very strong connection there. When we look at this cortex, this is where a lot of processing is going on. So your frontal lobe is a lot of your cognitive ability, your personality, critical thinking. A lot of that's in that frontal lobe. Here in the parietal lobe, we have the somatosensory and the motor cortex areas. Somatosensory is looking at essentially the senses coming from your skin, joints, muscles, touch, taste. Your nose is right there, so your olfactory bulb is processing smell. Temporal lobe is mostly for hearing and language abilities. Your occipital lobe is primarily for vision. Now let's take a look at the spinal cord. When you look at the vertebral column, at the level of each vertebrae, you have a pair of spinal nerves coming off. We see some cervical nerves up here, some thoracic nerves here, some lumbar nerves down here. And if we were to look at how that is connected to the spinal cord, which is deep inside of here, that's what we see over here on the left. We still see that gray matter right here. So that's where a lot of processing is happening. And then we see white matter. These are the highway system. When a spinal nerve comes in, it's going to be carrying information that's both sensory and motor. When it gets ready to enter the spinal cord, the sensory information is going to come around to the back and the dorsal side. This motor is going to be here in the front. So sensory information comes here around the back, we process it here, and then your motor signal is going to come out towards the front. This white matter is essentially sending signals up and down from the brain, and then of course side to side so that the two sides know what's going on. So if we take a look at the organization of the nervous system, we split it into the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and then everything outside the brain and spinal cord is considered the peripheral nervous system. And it's going to consist of ganglia and nerves. We also can separate the peripheral nervous system into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So somatic nervous system is essentially those things that we voluntarily control, like our skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system are those organs and glands that we do not voluntarily control. So they are under what we think of as more of an automatic control. That autonomic nervous system can then further be subdivided into the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic system. The way to remember these is the parasympathetic system is sometimes called our resting and digesting system. The sympathetic system is sometimes referred to as a fight or flight system. All of the different structures that receive innervation by the autonomic nervous system typically have two controls. They have one coming from the sympathetic system and one from the parasympathetic system. And so typically if one is being activated, the other one is being relaxed. Our parasympathetic system tends to cause these kinds of reactions on the left-hand side, and then the sympathetic system tends to cause the types of reactions we see on the right. With the sympathetic system, you can imagine that it's things that get us up and running away from danger. Dilation of pupil, that allows more light to come into your eye, increases your heart rate, dilates your bronchi so you can increase the airflow into your lungs. It's going to inhibit digestion. We don't need to be worried about that. We need to get up and run away. So those are those two different sides of that autonomic nervous system.